The Elder Scrolls has 10 playable races, and every single one of them is hiding something wild beneath the surface. From elves who want to literally destroy reality, to cat people whose bodies are determined by the moon, to lizards controlled by sentient trees. Today, I'm breaking down every race and everything you need to know about them, starting with the most arrogant species in all of Tamriel, Altmer. The Altmer, or High Elves, are so convinced of their own superiority that some of them want to unmake all of existence just to prove a point. And honestly, the lore kind of backs them up. These golden-skinned elves hail from the Somerset Isles and live anywhere from 300 to over 400 years. That's centuries of perfecting magic, hoarding knowledge, and looking down on literally everyone else. In Skyrim, they're built to be magical powerhouses. They start with a bonus 50 magicka, regenerate it 25% faster than any other race, and their highborn ability restores 25% of your maximum magicka per second for 60 seconds. You're basically a walking artillery cannon from level 1. But here's where it gets interesting. Altmer trace their bloodline directly back to the ancient Aldmer, the original elves of Tamriel. They consider themselves the purest descendants of that lineage, and that belief fuels everything about their culture. The Thalmor, their most extreme faction, took that ideology to its logical conclusion. Their endgame isn't conquest. It's not even domination. They want to undo the creation of the mortal world entirely and return to some kind of pre-existence divine state. Fans still can't agree whether that's terrifyingly logical extremism or straight-up cartoon villainy. Now, the Altmer are actually part of a bigger family. They share distant ancestry with the Bosmer, the Dunmer, and even the Orcs. All of them fall under the Mer umbrella, the elven races of Tamriel, and each one took that shared bloodline in a wildly different direction. Speaking of which, the Bosmer might be the most unhinged of the bunch. Bosmer are the wood elves of Tamriel, and on the surface, they seem pretty straightforward. They live in the forests of Valenwood. They're nimble, they're stealthy, and they're some of the best archers in the entire Elder Scrolls universe. In Skyrim, they start with a +10 bonus to archery and +5 to sneak, plus command animal, which lets you turn any beast into your temporary best friend. Standard wood elf stuff. Right? Wrong. Because Bosmer have the single weirdest cultural detail of any race in the game, and nobody talks about it enough. It's called the Green Pact. It's a binding religious agreement with the forest god Y'ffre, and it forbids Bosmer from harming any plant life. Period. No cutting trees, no picking flowers, no eating vegetables. Not a single leaf of lettuce has ever touched a Bosmer's plate. They are obligate carnivores by divine law. These elves literally cannot eat a salad. But here's where it gets truly unhinged. Because they can't use wood from living sources, their buildings are constructed from bone, animal hide, and the bodies of their enemies. And yes, they ritually consume their fallen foes. The Green Pact doesn't just shape their diet, it shapes their architecture, their warfare, and their dinner menu, which are sometimes the same thing. And then there's the footnote that the lore quietly drops and never fully explains. Bosmer can apparently breed with animals, sometimes producing hybrid offspring. It sits in canon like a grenade nobody wants to pick up, and the metaphysics behind it remain deliberately vague. So to recap, they can't eat a carrot, but they will eat you, and they might be raising half-beast children in the woods. Lovely people. But if the Bosmer sounds strange, the Dunmer are carrying the weight of an actual divine curse on their skin. Dunmer. Every Dunmer you've ever met in an Elder Scrolls game is walking proof of a god's wrath. That's not metaphor. That's literal canon. The Dunmer, or Dark Elves, weren't always gray-skinned and red-eyed. They used to be the Chimer, a golden-skinned elven people who followed the Daedric prince Azura. Then, around the Second Era, something happened that changed them forever. The details depend on which lore book you pick up, but the short version is this. Azura cursed the entire race. Their skin turned ash-gray. Their eyes burned red. And that transformation wasn't just cosmetic. It became the foundation of their entire civilization. Here's what makes the Dunmer fascinating. Most races would treat a divine curse as a tragedy. The Dunmer built a religion around it. The Tribunal Temple, led by 3 god kings, Vivec, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil, rose to power in the aftermath. These weren't just political leaders. They achieved actual godhood through questionable means. And the theological tension between Azura's authority and the Tribunal's stolen divinity fueled centuries of conflict, betrayal, and some of the densest lore in the entire franchise. If you you played Morrowind, you already know that game didn't just feature the Dunmer. It made you live inside their culture, their politics, their ash storms, their bizarre mushroom architecture. There's a reason fans still call it one of the greatest RPGs ever made, and a huge part of that is how fully realized Dunmer society felt. In Skyrim, they're no slouch either. A plus 10 boost to destruction right out of the gate. Solid secondary skill bonuses across light armor, alchemy, and illusion. 50% fire resistance. And Ancestor's Wrath, which wraps your character in flames, dealing 8 points of fire damage per second for 60 seconds. They're one of the few races that genuinely balance magic and melee without forcing you to pick a lane. But if you think a cursed civilization is rough, wait until you hear what happened to the orcs. Orc. Everyone writes off orcs as the hit things harder race. And yeah, they do hit things harder. But calling them dumb brutes is one of the laziest takes in Elder Scrolls, because orc society is actually one of the most internally consistent civilizations on the entire continent. Let's start with the obvious. Orsimer, their real name, are native to Orsinium and the Hrothgarian Mountains. They stand roughly 6 feet 8 to 6 feet 10, built like someone designed a person specifically for war. And their Skyrim racial power, Berserk Rage, is genuinely absurd. It doubles your damage output while cutting incoming damage in half for 60 seconds. That's not a buff. That's a cheat code. The 24-hour cooldown exists because without it, the game would break. But here's where it gets interesting. Orc society runs entirely on the stronghold system. Clans earn territory through combat. Social standing is determined by physical dominance. There are no ambassadors, no trade negotiations, no elder councils debating policy for 6 months. Just the chief, the rules, and the consequences if you break them. Every member knows exactly where they stand at all times. No politics, no backstabbing, no pretending. You want something? Fight for it. That's it. And their spiritual life is equally distinct. Orcs practice ancestor veneration and shamanism rather than organized religion, setting them apart from nearly every other race on the continent. No temples, no clergy hierarchy, no divine mandates. Just honoring the dead who came before you. Now here's the part that surprises everyone. Orc are technically elves. The name Orsimer literally means pariah folk in Aldmeris, connecting them directly to the ancient Aldmer. The community still debates whether they truly belong in the Mer category or stand entirely apart, and the lore keeps it deliberately ambiguous. But the bloodline is there. So the Dumb Brute race has elven ancestry, a fully functional honor-based society, and one of the most overpowered racial abilities in the game. Not bad for a group everyone underestimates. But speaking of unexpected ancestry, wait until you hear about the Bretons Breton. Now we cross the line from mare to men, and the first race on the human side is already cheating. Breton are technically human, but calling them purely human is like calling a mule purely a horse. It's not wrong, but it's definitely not the whole story. Breton are native to High Rock, and their entire existence traces back to ancient interbreeding between early humans and the Aldmer. That makes them the only human race in Elder Scrolls with confirmed elven blood running through their veins. And it's not just a lore footnote. Some Breton individuals still carry visible elven traits, pointed ears, sharper facial features, the works. They are walking, talking proof that the line between mare and men isn't as clean as anyone pretends. Here's where it gets interesting mechanically. That elven heritage translates directly into gameplay. In Skyrim, Bretons start with 25% magic resistance baked right into their blood. On top of that, their racial power Dragonskin absorbs 50% of all incoming spell magicka for 60 seconds. So you've got a human race that shrugs off magic better than most elves, while also getting solid skill bonuses in conjuration. That combination is absurd, and the community still underrates it. But the culture is just as fascinating. High Rock has never, in the entire history of Elder Scrolls, been unified under a single ruler. It's a fractured mess of competing city-states, noble houses, and political backstabbing. That constant diplomacy shaped the Breton identity. They're scholars, courtiers, and negotiators, not conquerors. They win with words and wards, not swords. Breton are the biological bridge between elves and humans, and honestly, the perfect transition into the rest of the men on this list. But if Breton are the diplomats, the next race built an entire empire on bureaucracy and law, Imperial. Every race on this list has something weird going on. Elven blood, lizard biology, moon-based shape-shifting, Imperials have spreadsheets, and honestly, that might be more dangerous than all of it. Imperials are native to Cyrodiil, and they're the default face of Oblivion, which tells you everything you need to know. They're the most normal race in a franchise full of cat people and sentient trees. No supernatural gimmick. No divine curse. Just humans who figured out that organization beats raw power every single time. Their Skyrim stats reflect this perfectly. Plus 10 to restoration, plus 5 to block, heavy armor, one-handed, destruction, and enchanting. A mixed bag of combat and magic with zero specialization. And then there's Voice of the Emperor, a racial power that calms nearby humanoids for 60 seconds. Not flashy, not broken, just diplomatically useful. It's literally the racial equivalent of scheduling a meeting. But here's the thing. Imperial power was never supposed to live in their bodies. It lives in their institutions. The Elder Council, the Blades, the Church of the Nine. Centuries of bureaucratic infrastructure that turned one city-state into a continent-spanning empire. While Altmer were perfecting magic and orcs were punching mountains, Imperials were writing tax codes and building roads. And they won. They ruled Tamriel for entire eras, not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they had systems. Now, the community discourse around Imperials is exactly what you'd expect. They're the boring race. And mechanically, there's truth to that. Nobody's making highlight reels of Voice of the Emperor. But narratively, the argument for playing an Imperial in a game literally about empires collapsing is hard to dismiss. They are civilization. That's either the dullest thing on this list or the entire point, depending on who you ask. But if Imperials built the empire through paperwork, the next race on this list tried to tear it apart with pure, frost-blooded stubbornness. Nord. If there's one race on this list you already know, it's this one. Nord are the home team of Skyrim, and Skyrim is the game that introduced an entire generation to Elder Scrolls. They're the most played race and the most popular entry in the franchise. And honestly, they earned it. Nord are Viking fantasy cranked to 11. 50% frost resistance baked into their biology. A starting plus 10 to two-handed with plus 5 bonuses to block, one-handed, smithing, light armor, and speech. Plus a racial power called Battle Cry that makes every enemy nearby turn and run for 30 seconds. They're built for one thing: walking into a fight and refusing to leave until someone's dead. But the culture is where it gets interesting. Everything about Nord society is ripped from Norse mythology and amplified. Honor codes, ancestor veneration, standing stones scattered across the tundra, burial mounds filled with Draugr who refuse to stay dead. Their pantheon includes Talos, a man who became a god, and Ysgramor, basically their version of a founding warrior king. It's real-world Viking tradition filtered through a fantasy lens, with the volume turned all the way up. Here's the thing though, Nord are also the most openly racist civilization you encounter in Skyrim. Walk into Windhelm, and you'll find dark elves crammed into a slum called the Grey Quarter, treated like garbage by the very people asking you to fight for their freedom. The game puts you in this uncomfortable position where you're supposed to sympathize with Nord values, their independence, their warrior spirit, while watching them treat other races like dirt. The community has been arguing about this for over a decade, and nobody's won. And then there's Sovngarde, the Nord afterlife. A warrior's paradise reserved exclusively for those who die gloriously in battle. Their entire culture is oriented around not fearing death, because death done right is the greatest reward imaginable. It explains everything about them. The bravery, the stubbornness, the willingness to start wars they might not win. When your heaven has an entrance exam that requires dying with a sword in your hand, peace was never really on the table. But if Nord built their identity around the sword, the next race on this list perfected it. Redguard. After 3 human races that all pull from roughly the same European playbook, the Redguard hit different. Their entire aesthetic, culture, and spiritual framework draws from Arab, African, and Middle Eastern traditions, making them the most visually and thematically distinct race in the men category. And honestly, they might be the most underappreciated race in the entire franchise. Let's start with the build. In Skyrim, Redguard get a plus 10 bonus to one-handed, plus 5 to block, plus 5 to alteration, plus 5 to destruction, and adrenaline rush for massively boosted stamina regeneration. Notice the emphasis. The tiny magical bonuses exist on paper. but the entire kit screams melee fighter. This is a race built around hitting things with swords and refusing to stop swinging while doing it. The arcane nods are an afterthought. The real identity is steel and willpower, but the lore is where Redguard truly separate themselves from every other race on this list. Their ancestry traces back to the Yokudans, an ancient civilization with its own cosmology that has almost nothing in common with the rest of Tamriel's theology. The Redguard creation myth centers on Sadakal, a serpent god who devours the entire world and then recreates it in an endless cycle of destruction and rebirth. That's not a variation on the standard Aedra and Daedra framework. That's a completely independent spiritual system. No other race in Elder Scrolls has anything like it. Here's where it gets genuinely impressive though. After the Great War, when the Empire signed the White Gold Concordat and basically surrendered to the Aldmeri Dominion, Hammerfell said no. The Empire abandoned them, cut them loose entirely, and the Redguard kept fighting, alone, against the single most powerful military and magical force on the continent, and they won. Hammerfell forced the Thalmor into a treaty on Redguard terms, making it the only province to successfully repel the Dominion through pure martial resistance. Swordsmanship beat organized magical supremacy. As of Skyrim's timeline, Hammerfell stands free and independent. The community reads that as one of the most quietly powerful statements in Elder Scrolls lore. While every other nation bent the knee or crumbled, the Redguard proved that you don't need magic to be unstoppable. You just need to refuse to lose. But now we're leaving the races of men entirely and stepping into something far stranger. Because the Beastfolk don't just look different, they aren't even built the same way. Argonian. Now we enter Beastfolk territory, and we're starting with the single most unsettling biological concept in the entire Elder Scrolls universe. Argonians are the lizard people of Blackmarsh. On the surface, they're a survival-focused race with 50% disease resistance, natural water breathing, bonuses to lockpicking and pickpocket, and Hisskin, which regenerates health 10 times faster than normal for 60 seconds. They're built to thrive in environments that kill literally everything else. Solid kit, interesting aesthetic, cool. But the lore behind Argonians goes somewhere genuinely disturbing. The Hist. The Hist are sentient ancient tree entities that have existed since before recorded history. They're not normal plants. They're an alien intelligence. And here's where it gets dark. When Argonian eggs hatch, the newborns are brought to the Hist trees. The hatchlings drink the sap of the Hist, and that interaction physically shapes what they become. Horns, spines, tail shape, behavioral tendencies, all of it is determined by the Hist, not by genetics, not by natural selection, by a non-humanoid alien consciousness making deliberate decisions about what each Argonian will be. That makes Argonians the only race in Elder Scrolls that is effectively a manufactured species. Every physical variation, every mutation, every behavioral pattern is downstream of Hist decision-making. The Hist aren't just worshipped by Argonians. The Hist literally built them, and the lore refuses to answer the obvious question. If your body was shaped by an alien tree and your thoughts were influenced from birth, are you actually making choices? Or are you executing programming? Whether Argonians possess genuine free will or are fundamentally servants of the Hist is a question Bethesda has deliberately left unanswered. And depending on who you ask, that silence is either the most frustrating thing in Elder Scrolls lore or the most brilliant. It doesn't help that Blackmarsh remains the least explored region in the entire setting. The Empire repeatedly tried to colonize it and failed. Outsiders who enter rarely come back. Canonical documentation of Argonian society from an actual Argonian perspective is almost non-existent. The mystery isn't an oversight, it's structural. The place is so hostile that the most powerful empire on the continent just gave up trying to understand it. But if you think a race manufactured by alien trees is strange, wait until you meet the race whose entire body is determined by the moons. Khajiit. Khajiit are Elder Scrolls cat people, and if that's all you know about them, you're missing one of the strangest pieces of world building in the entire franchise. On the surface, they're straightforward. Native to Elsweyr, Khajiit are natural-born thieves and brawlers, at least by their stat sheet. In Skyrim, they get a +10 bonus to sneak, and their claws deal 12 extra points of unarmed damage right out of the gate. They even have their own language, Ta'agra, with a completely separate script from Common Tamrielic. Cool, interesting cat people with claws and an accent. But here's where it gets genuinely weird. A Khajiit's physical form, their actual body, is determined entirely by which moons were in which phase the moment they were born. Tamriel has 2 moons, Masr and Secunda, and the specific combination of their cycles at the time of birth dictates what kind of Khajiit you become. Not genetics, not bloodline, the sky. And we're not talking about minor variations. At least 16 documented forms exist. Some Khajiit are tiny house cat-sized creatures called Alfik. Others are massive quadrupedal beasts called Senche that other Khajiit literally ride into battle. 2 siblings born months apart could look like completely different species, with different capabilities, different social roles, and potentially different relationships to sentience itself. The version you see in most Elder Scrolls games? That's likely the Cathay, the bipedal, human-sized form. Bethesda has never officially confirmed the exact breed, but it's the only type that works with standard armor and animation rigs. The community has pointed this out for years. It's a gameplay concession that quietly erases the most fascinating thing about Khajiit lore. And then there's the discrimination. Khajiit are barred from entering cities in Skyrim. They're stereotyped as thieves and skooma dealers. They were enslaved under Dominion rule. The games present this prejudice clearly, but never fully interrogate it, and whether that's intentional social commentary or just an oversight has been debated since Oblivion. But honestly, none of that is what makes Khajiit unforgettable. In a setting full of magically gifted elves and supernaturally resilient warriors, the most interesting thing about Khajiit is that the moon decided who they'd be before they ever took their first breath. No choice, no bloodline, just the sky, the timing, and whatever shape the light demanded. If you enjoyed this video and want to see every interesting NPC in World of Warcraft, click the video on the screen now.